Friedrich Hayek is a well-known libertarian whose free market theories have been influential among conservatives. Much of the defense of free market economics that you see in conservative intellectuals, like Paul Gottfried or Thomas Sowell, is based on the notions of Hayek. For example, the calculation problem and the idea of the free market as an information aggregating device comes from both Mises and Hayek. So this is the origin of Sowell's idea that mundane information is more effective than specialized knowledge. In effect, Sowell has turned knowledge into a market. This idea also comes implicitly from Hayek through his concept of catalexy, as we will soon learn. Hayek has generated a lively intellectual discourse. Alain de Benoist, in Against Liberalism, Society is Not a Market, has a lengthy biography of critiques against Hayek, whose footnote takes up an entire page. Hayek's ideas, thus, have been veritably run through a blender. Before we get to Benoist's critique itself, we have to understand what Hayek's basic theory is. The free market, to Hayek, results from natural evolution. He is more or less a Darwinian picture of the formation of the market. It came into being not by deliberate human action, but rather it is an adaptation to the demands of modern societies. As such, it is a spontaneous order that exists independent of and prior to human individuals and sociality, since humans do not determine their own will or ends. Since it was evolutionarily adapted, it is thus also necessarily the best system, supposedly because it won out over the competition. This point of view has only been solidified by exponents of Hayek after the collapse of the Soviet Union, hence Fukuyama's end of history. Hayek then posits the idea of catalexy. Catalexy is the idea that human behaviors occur emergently from individual actions in a market. As such, the market is all-encompassing. All human actions are reducible to market actions. Hayek believes that humans can never have perfect knowledge of all of the information available in a market, and as such, humans cannot possibly calculate ends. They simply perform actions based on their best guesses, according to cost-benefit analysis and rational self-interest. Hayek believes that humans do not make actions according to definite ends because humans cannot possibly know these ends according to the fact of imperfect information. As a result, markets are systems of means, and thus, according to catalexy, all human action, politics, and morality is essentially procedural. Finally, according to Hayek, it is not by nature that men are free, but rather it is only within the market that man can be free, since he is there unencumbered by taboos and obligations. Quote, "It is not the freedom of agents that allows exchange, but exchange that allows their freedom," according to de Benoist. Hayek adopts a dichotomy very similar to Karl Popper's, which is between the closed society of tribalism and the great society that consists of impersonal and abstract exchange. Ironically, it is to the great society that Hayek attributes tradition. Tradition is simply the continuation of customs that benefit the market, and we will see later why Hayek is here only playing word games. That is the basic schema of Hayek's market theory. This theory has certain consequences for politics. Hayek more or less adopts the position of Republican liberalism, such as the division of powers, representation, democracy, and self-rule. But since all morality is procedural, and since all human action is economic in nature, the state must make no laws that impede individuals' actions in the market. The state simply serves to protect the right of people to participate in the market. Hayek even goes as far as to approve of private monopolies and to argue for the private minting of currency. We then arrive at Alain de Benoist's critique. First, he points out that Hayek's concept of catalexy and the pre-social emergence of the market as spontaneous order legitimates the neoliberal view of social phenomena, the idea that all spheres of human activity resemble markets. Today, we constantly hear the phrase sexual marketplace or the term sexual market value. Most of us recoil at the thought, since these terms imply that humans, and especially women, are commodities that can be freely exchanged. In other words, it is a red-pilled conservative version of the liberal fungibility of people. The idea that a human personality can be reduced to a singular quantitative value is in itself the vision of neoliberalism, no matter the context or who's being an exponent of it. We see this in Hayek's evaluations of a person's social worth, since if a person is useless, they are without value. If they are without value, then they deserve to lose. Moreover, Benoist points out that this view, most of all, affects the market. There is such a thing as a vote market, and politicians are simply trying to satisfy the demands of voters. It is this pre-social, spontaneous order that is, quote, no longer just the model for human activity, but that activity itself. This view, to Benoist, is the reduction of all human action to commercial exchange. Hayek, in the end, is simply reiterating the bourgeois formulation of Homo economicus. Benoist then differentiates between Hayek's spontaneous order and natural order. Spontaneous order is that which originates at a particular period of time according to specific conditions. Hayek frames this as though such an order constitutes a holistic tradition or a natural condition for man that is always valid. But since this order requires certain modern prerequisites to exist, that cannot be true. It is instead the apex point of an arc of evolutionary progress. In short, it is just the historicist notion of progress all over again. This constitutes a gap in which Hayek cannot explain why society transitioned from the closed society to the great society. In contrast, Benoist presents the natural order of Joseph de Maistre, where tribalism and absolute monarchy accord to higher values intrinsic in human nature, and as such appear over and over again throughout history. It is a natural order in the sense that it is organic and emerges from the very substance of man and the universe. It represents a holistic unity, whereas Hayek's evolutionism is only a contingent self-arrangement of parts into an amalgamation. Benoist makes the argument that, according to Bertrand Russell, a class cannot be a member of itself. Thus, the emergent society cannot be a holism. Moreover, Hayek's spontaneous order model carries yet another political implication, which is that if man is already intrinsically social, then there is no need to facilitate his sociality. Therefore, politics becomes increasingly irrelevant, even dangerous. This is the basis for him to declare that government intervention leads to totalitarianism. But there is no reason to think that at all, since even Hayek's market requires the state to function. Hayek's main point of attack is against what he calls constructivism. Constructivism is what he calls a, quote, synoptic illusion that consists in believing social arrangements can result from the intentions and voluntary actions of men. In other words, that it is possible to build or reform society in view of a given project. Again, similar to Karl Popper, he states that the flaw with constructivism, which he sees as a kind of social engineering, is that planners don't have the necessary available information to actually solve the problems they have discerned. Hayek believes that constructivism originates in scientism, since social engineers and reformers treat society as if it were an experiment or an object. Moreover, he believes that constructivism is an atavism of the idea of tribal solidarity and altruism. Thus, in socialism, which Hayek sees as constructivist par excellence, he sees a decisively anti-modern way of structuring society. But Benoist argues that what Hayek sees as socialism is not necessarily Marxism, but rather basically when the government does stuff. Anything from redistribution of wealth to environmental laws, protectionism, and minor currency regulation is, to Hayek, socialist constructivism. Hayek associates tribal societies with constructivism, but pre-modern societies were actually, as Benoist argues, more so the result of emergent behavior than modern societies. Although Benoist says that the dichotomy between emergence and intentionality is artificial. Nevertheless, he points out how capitalism did not arise emergently, but rather it was an intentional effort by states to combine their long and short distance commerce together, as well as bringing non-commercial exchange into the market in order to levy taxes on it. He previously gave the example of the Carpathian kingdom allying with the bourgeoisie to bypass the authority of lords, which granted the bourgeoisie greater economic freedom, which they used to establish the first markets in France. In summation, capitalism was never an emergent development. The development of the market was an intentional effort that was carried out due to the conditions of power and class relations. In my video on Thomas Sowell, you may have seen his critique of social justice. He says that social justice doesn't exist and that it violates the rule of law. Well, this critique actually comes directly from Hayek. Hayek states that social justice is a, quote, inept incantation, a mirage, an anthropomorphic illusion, and an ontological absurdity. He argues that it only makes sense within a tribal order. The basis for his argument is, first of all, that since we cannot know ends, justice cannot have ends as its basis, only means. And second, that market societies, which accord with the concept of catalexy, are impersonal games where the rules are fair for everyone, and thus everyone has an equal chance of being a winner or a loser. Benoist sums this up as, quote, we owe obedience to the market order because it was not willed by anybody and imposed itself on its own. Man must follow the established order without trying to understand it, and especially without rebelling against it. Secondarily, the losers must give themselves a new philosophical morality, according to which it is simply normal to accept the course of events when they are unfavorable to you. This is a naked apology of success. Against this, Benoist points out that individuals have different capacities, and as such, those who win and those who lose will tend to be the same respective people, which is far from a condition of an equal chance at winning. Another one of Hayek's arguments is that social justice is just the reemergence of the logic of the scapegoat. If the market is the cause of inequalities, and the market is impersonal and fair, then no one can be blamed for its outcomes. Benoist rebuts by stating that this logic can be turned against catalepsy. The natural evolution of humanity has resulted in the norm that we should not blame them. And in the case of the market, the loser is the guilty party. Hayek is simply saying that we ought to scapegoat and blame the loser for the outcomes of the market system. Benoist therefore concludes that the doctrine of impersonal fairness has, quote, the great advantage of forbidding us from assessing the market and reality through its concrete effects. One further problem with Hayek's assumptions regarding constructivism is his insistence that problems, because they arise out of no one's fault, should never be solved. Benoist says that this attitude is a contradiction because the encounter with problems is itself a technical process and thus does not in any way violate the spontaneous order. Further, he argues that simply because a problem is no one's fault, this does not necessitate that we cannot solve it. He says that the conditions of the sea or the air are no one's fault, but that we should still argue that one could better engineer planes and ships to resist those conditions. In the end, Hayek's refusal of problem solving is just his preference. He does not in any way prove it necessary that we should approach society in this way. It is akin to arguing that man, because he is not omniscient, is powerless. As Benoist wrote, quote, to say that the market is neither just nor unjust amounts in fact to saying that the market, along with its effects, must be removed from human judgment, that it is the new divinity, the new and unique God before whom we must bow. Finally, Hayek's notion of society is actually not that opposed to Marx's quote-unquote constructivism. Because it is unpolitical, it accords with the Marxist doctrine that the state should wither away in favor of the right of individuals to determine themselves and their social conditions. Marxism, thus, is in the end an individualist doctrine, and in its case, the doctrine of the non-political nature of society has led to the most intense form of totalitarianism. Benoist asserts that the same would occur for Hayek's market society in its frantic desire to eliminate politics. As Hannah Arendt has said, totalitarianism has more to do with eliminating politics than spreading it into every sector. This makes a lot of sense once you realize that an intrinsic part of politics is opposition and disagreement, which is a concomitant part of the decision-making process. If we want an apolitical society, we have to end disagreement. It leads to the one-party state. Then we arrive at Hayek's concept of tradition. For Hayek, a tradition is simply something that favors the emergence of the spontaneous abstract order. As such, it has nothing in common with what we normally refer to as integral traditions, such as religious rites, rituals, dogma, and worship. Tradition, since it is reducible to whatever facilitates the evolution of the market, cannot really be tradition in the eyes of Benoist, because what really properly constitutes a tradition is by necessity particular and non-universal as it pertains to concrete people. In contrast, the Western universalization of its principles is a quote-unquote steamroller of traditions. Quote, it is easy to see that Hayekian traditionalism only refers to the tradition of the extinction of traditions. Benoist then critiques the nation-state and the concept of national capitalism that is so often associated with Hayek. One exponent of this is Martinez Politics, who I almost don't want to mention to avoid giving him relevance, as if I had a high-view account anyway. But I think it's important to demonstrate how this attempt to combine regionalist particularity with capitalism is doomed to failure. Benoist sees the nation-state as a bourgeois and modern development that coincided with the destruction of the particularity of peoples and their natural bonds and relations. It is, in essence, a kind of fiction that attempts to compensate for the loss of a common solidarity, lexicon of myths, and imaginary symbols, but which cannot last because it is not tied to any concrete thing, only various legalisms. Liberals tried to tie free market economics to the nation-state, but the problem is that the functioning of the emergent invisible hand renders all borders and barriers obsolete, since the only rule of the market is accumulation. Immersion is subject to, quote, no non-economic form of belonging, and as such he cannot be constrained by the market. Benoist quotes Adam Smith, quote, "A merchant is not necessarily the citizen of any particular country. It is in a great measure indifferent to him what place he carries on in his trade, and a very trifling disgust will make him remove his capital, and together with it, all the industry which it supports, from one country to another." Benoist then gives a short critique of Hayek's evolutionist view. Hayek thinks that the market is the best organization for society because it was what is adapted. But Benoist, quoting Roger Friedman, shows that adaptation is very banal, since every adaptation society makes is going to be successful for it. And second, that Hayek's claim is unverifiable because if we accept that institutions are adapted, then we have no way of escaping circular logic. Moreover, Benoist points out that the market has not been selected everywhere, and so we cannot claim that it is the best. Hayek provides no reason why the free market has arisen only in the West and not in the Middle East or Far East. Another contradiction in Hayek's formulation is the notion that markets are the best because they allow everyone to satisfy their given ends. But he has previously stated that people's ends are unknowable to subjects. Furthermore, Alain de Benoist argues that markets tend to multiply people's ends, and so a market would not be better at satisfying a person's ends than a tribalistic society, which has considerably fewer ends. Additionally, in regard to liberty, Hayek reduces liberty to that which guarantees the functioning of the market. But Benoist argues that this reduces the definition of liberty to well-being, and so it violates Hayek's previous rejection of utilitarianism, utilitarianism being the idea that the highest good is the satisfaction of the greatest number of people. In the end, Benoist concludes that Hayek's society, because it consists of such contradictions, injustices, and inequalities without any form of solidarity, would implode on itself. Thus, it would require the most intense form of constructivism to function. It would necessarily be a dictatorial state. Benoist ends by quoting Albert Hirschman, denouncing the conflation of economic interests with civic obligations. To this, Benoist replies that people can claim today to be renewing national thinking by basing themselves on this kind of theory says a great deal about the collapse of such thinking.